Today I am here with Nick Nielsen, Geopolicratus, who has a wonderful channel that everyone should go and peruse. He's got a wealth of offerings there, including the newsletter and the series Today in the History of Philosophy. I've learned a great deal, especially about figures that are under-discussed in both philosophy and history. I love your channel because of the eclectic variety of thinkers that you cover. Before we begin our own conversation about philosophy of history and probably also the history of philosophy, Nick, could you introduce yourself to the audience, people who might not be familiar with you, what your background is, and how you became interested in philosophy?
Thank you for the invitation to your show. Hello, my name is Nick. I've been blogging since 2008. I started writing philosophy of history posts on a Quora space, and that started to get a certain following, I guess you could say. And after writing posts about philosophy of history there for several years, I started then at the very end of 2023 and the beginning of 2024, I started the videos on Today in Philosophy of History. So I've been doing those. I don't have a video every day, but I try to do something as regularly as I can. I started out with an enormous backlog because I'd been writing these posts for 3 years or so. So I had a Word file that's 900 pages long with all my written posts. So then when I started doing the videos, which I also record as audio, so I make them available on Spotify. I've been writing a newsletter. When I stopped blogging regularly, then I started writing a newsletter once a week. And then just recently, in the end of last year, I started doing the video and audio recordings of my newsletter. So the videos started out focused on philosophy of history, and the newsletters are more widely ranging. They'll touch on anything that interests me. The philosophy of history gave me a real agenda and a focus. So I started focusing on the birthdays of historians and philosophers, which, if you go back in time, they're not really well recorded. But then I'd pick out a few historical events like, Captain Cook discovering the Hawaiian Islands and Caesar crossing the Rubicon, things like that. So whenever I have a date that I can tie to a calendar date, then I have a pretext on which I can hang my own views about philosophy of history, which is a running theme that goes throughout all that material. My familiar talking points that the people who have listened to a few episodes will probably start to get a picture of.
What was the text you read, or what was a first brush with philosophy of history that really got you interested in it?
I'm not sure about the first brush with it, but I was always intrinsically interested in history. And I became interested in philosophy as a teenager, but I spent most of my adult life reading works in philosophy of logic and philosophy of mathematics. But I always had history in the back of my mind. I can say. I just remembered. Darren Staloff did a series of lectures for what was then called the Teaching Company. I think they call themselves the Great Courses now. He did a series of lectures on philosophy of history. The Great Courses has discontinued that, but I still have it on cassette tape and is also available on YouTube for free. And that was influential on me because that was my first sustained engagement with philosophy of history. And then I wrote a blog post after listening to that. And I wrote, if I lectured on philosophy of history, and I laid out, the figures that Darren Staloff addressed in his lectures. And I said, you could write another history of the philosophy of history, avoiding all of these major figures and just focusing on all these other figures, because there's so many people that said something of relevance. And so in my episodes, I've continued that, branching out into other figures that might not immediately seem relevant to philosophy. So not only have I discussed historians and philosophers of history, I've also discussed archaeologists like V. Gordon Childe, architects, but anybody I can find that's done something interesting or something that's, in my view, changed the direction of history through their interventions, whatever that intervention may be, whether it be, like I say, in archaeology or architecture or city planning or what have you, there's usually something that shines a light on our time-bound lives, as it were.
Who would you say, out of all those interventions into history, What's maybe the most, in your opinion, under-discussed or underrated? Like if
I
you could
would
get everyone on this podcast to read someone that they probably haven't read, right?
Okay,
Who would you suggest?
Saint Augustine's City of God.
Mm,
Um, there are there are philosophers who have written papers that deny that Saint Augustine had a philosophy of history, because this is the phrase philosophy of history wasn't coined until Voltaire used it in the 18th century as a title of one of his books. So many people trace
mm,
the origins of philosophy of history to Voltaire, and then obviously it develops rapidly after that. But you've got this long prehistory where people wrote about history, but they didn't call it philosophy of history. And like I said, there are some scholars who deny that Augustine had a philosophy of history, and of course, Augustine is an incredibly influential figure in Western history. So there's hundreds, probably thousands of books about Augustine out there, but they tend to focus on his theology, which is, of course, where he's been most influential. But the the City of God has been a really important book to me, because not only is it about history, but also it actually takes a perspective on philosophy of history that really appeals to me. He goes Because as a Christian, Augustine wanted to show that there was a beginning to history, and all of previous philosophy had held that the world had always been there in some form of another, and then history went through cycles. This is common. Plato writes about historical cycles. Polybius
right.
writes about historical cycles. This is
And
really
you have
common.
like Anaximander and Heraclitus have a
Yes.
sort of cyclical view as well. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So yeah, and the view was, the world ended in a big deluge, and there was a blank slate, and then society could start again. And I recently said in one of my episodes, we can contrast this to Ibn Khaldun, who was the Islamic philosopher of history in the 14th century, I think, who in his cyclical history, instead of being the world being reset by a deluge, the people from failed cities are turned back out into a primordial desert, and they're there to start over again. But it's a cyclical motif, but it's taken up in a different social and even a different climatic context. So I was beginning to say that this was Augustine needs to address this issue. And in fact, the whole industry of philosophy in late antiquity, where we've got philosophers who are increasingly influenced by Christianity, John Philoponus and Simplicius and people like that, they're taking up these ancient arguments of the infinity or eternity of the world, and then trying to show that the world, in fact, is finite and history doesn't repeat. So this is something that Augustine digs into, not only in his City of God, but also, I think it's the 11th book of his Confessions, is his famous treatment of the philosophy of time. And elsewhere, also in the Confessions, he delves into some historical issues. So there's a lot. Augustine, despite his apparent, ideologically driven disinterest in the city of man in favor of the city of God, he's still very alive to the issues of temporality and historicity. And his treatment of history in the City of God, once again, it takes up a lot of technical issues that end up, in my view, being a very big picture approach to taking history in what we would today call deep time, because he's interested in the big theological picture, how the universe was laid down by God, as it were.
Mm. Okay, that's very interesting. I do love Augustine's Confessions. I like a lot of what he has to say on memory, or I find it fascinating. I feel like I'm with Augustine experiencing a very foreign perspective to my own, but that's a lot of why I like reading these old books. So that's interesting. So because I've heard you speak quite a bit about, or I've read your articles and I've heard you speak about both Hegel and Schopenhauer, who are sort of you could, it's oversimplifying a little bit, but you could sort of use them as archetypal representatives of this idea of whether or not there's a progression or development within history, or whether it's just sort of a recurring, meaningless process. I mean, with Hegel, obviously, you have him saying the history of the world is the development of this idea of freedom. It's this process of the realization of spirit, whereas Schopenhauer, he has this passage where he says, everyone who postulates constructions about the world in motion, or as they call it, history, haven't grasped the fundamental truth that what really is the same at all times, which could be seen as, people will relate this to optimism and pessimism, or a progressive view, or versus Schopenhauer's more focused on asceticism and these sorts of things. But there's a sort of a deeper question there, right, as to whether or not there is a development, or whether it's just sort of I love that Toynbee quote that history is just one damn thing after another. Where do you stand on that issue of whether or not there's a development or a progress within history? I can kind of guess because of what you said about Augustine, but I'm wondering just how you would disentangle all that.
I agree that Hegel is certainly the archetypal philosopher of history. Schopenhauer is a nice counter to that because he personally disliked Hegel,
Right.
and because he did say that there's nothing, basically what Ecclesiastes says, that there is no new thing under the sun. What has been, and what will be, will be. So
Hmm.
in my episode on Schopenhauer for Today in Philosophy of History, I talked about his view that everything need to know about history is already in Herodotus. So Herodotus has all these, anything you can find in Herodotus is going to explain anything you're going to find anywhere in history, anywhere. So he doesn't say outright history repeats itself, but he basically says all the elements are there, and you're not going to find anything new. And yeah, Hegel has this big picture of the development of human freedom through various societies and civilizations. Since one of my talking points that I come back to time and again is that a philosophy of history needs to be founded in a philosophy of time, because history is a function of time. I'm interested in setting human history in the context of natural history. And that means that it's a non-traditional approach, because traditionally the most narrow conception of history was that history begins with written records. So when the people in the Mesopotamia started imprinting a wedge-shaped stylus onto clay tablets and created cuneiform, then history starts, and the practice of writing spreads, and that only takes us back about 5,000 years.
Mm.
If you context now, that narrow, I should say, that narrow conception of history has been breaking down for at least 100 years primarily because of archaeology, but also what are called the auxiliary sciences of history. There are 24 specializations with all kinds of weird labels, like campanology, which is a study of bells, and sigillography, which is a study of seals, and all these seem to be highly specialized things that people spend their entire careers trying to lay out the basic principles of. They have greatly expanded history, and most especially archaeology has expanded history. So all these societies that were completely lost to history, like, for example, the Indus Valley civilization.
Hmm.
Indus Valley civilization in the Asian subcontinent had been completely lost to history. There were no written records about it. It remains controversial whether they had a written language or not, because there are artifacts that have been found that have symbols on them that may have been a language, but nobody has been able to decipher it as a language. But it was lost to historical memory. And then an English colonial, I think it was Sir Mortimer Wheeler, if memory serves, uh, started digging around, and he found these what turned out to be amazing, huge cities. Now, it happened that the people of the Indus Valley civilizations didn't build anything as monumental as the pyramids, which have stuck out of the ground for 2,400 years, or I should say 4,500 years, closer to 5,000
Hmm.
years. So we resurrected this entire history, and now it's become commonplace for archaeologists, together with historians, to reconstruct the entire histories of people who never wrote their own history, or didn't have a history, or had a history, but they didn't have the technology of writing, so it's been lost to us, as with the Indus Valley civilization, which is the Indus Valley civilization is now called, the first urbanization of the Indian subcontinent, with the later Vedic civilization being the second urbanization, because the whole area was covered in cities, and then those all collapsed, failed, population scattered, and then eventually, thousands of years later, it was built up with cities again. I don't think you can write that off. To me, it's all part of history. Ultimately, when you set this larger history revealed to us through scientific methods and auxiliary sciences of history, you can no longer really take this view of Hegel that you can take it as a nested periodization within the larger periodization of human history, and then the larger periodization of human history takes us nested place within the larger context of natural history. And this is
Right.
one of the things I've been writing about recently, both in my newsletters and in Today in Philosophy of History episodes, is the possibility of a history of intelligence in the universe. If we were to establish contact with another intelligence, presumably naturally evolved on some other world, then they would have a history, and then there would be a history of them and a history of us, but then there would be a larger construction, which is the history of intelligence in the universe, which could be very brief, could be very long, could go way back into the past, could go way forward into the future. So that's what I see as the future of history and philosophy of history, is seeing these very large structures that extend into natural history and a scientific understanding of the universe. And another of my talking points that I always mention is that I'm taking a naturalistic approach. So Hegel isn't a naturalistic approach.
Right.
Collingwood is a naturalistic approach. Schopenhauer is a naturalistic approach. But I use their insights and try to reframe them in naturalistic terms so we can put it in the context of the scientific account of the universe as we know it today. So is there progress? Well, there's got to be change because, planets form, biospheres evolve, and eventually they will die, and eventually things will go on and move on. The larger the scales you reach for, the blurrier our knowledge gets. So we're going to have a much clearer understanding of human history, even an extended sense of human history that goes back into human ancestors and goes on to successor species of humanity. And we might be able to say something about progress there. I think it's pretty clear that even with
That's somewhat of a Nietzschean idea in a way. The successor species to humankind, the Übermensch.
yeah. There's a great passage in Nietzsche where he says that man is a rope stretched over an abyss between animal and Superman.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there was an ancient philosopher who used the term hyperanthropos, which is just another way of saying Übermensch. So
Right.
yeah, the idea, and also is called transhumanism today, things like that. The whole idea of a technological singularity of human beings merging with machines and going on and doing their own thing in their own way. So yeah, that is a Nietzschean theme. He wasn't limiting himself to human beings, but saw forward to the possibility of an overman.
So when we expand our viewpoint out from this like 5,000 year period that traditional history has focused itself on and allow the entire breadth and scope of the natural sciences to inform our view of history, it seems like what you're saying is that sort of debates between like Hegel and Schopenhauer kind of become almost not as meaningful to us. That our knowledge becomes much blurrier, and that really these are questions of perhaps grander problems of the entire natural history of man as an organism, and then embedded in a philosophy of time.
That's a pretty good way of putting it. I think we can still draw insights from all. Obviously, if I didn't think we could draw insights, I wouldn't have spent so much time
Right.
reading Hegel and Schopenhauer and trying to formulate them in what I consider to be a naturalistically acceptable framework. And like I said, it's still very relevant for what's right in front of our faces in our daily. We always talk about how everything has changed and nothing is going to be the same again, but in fact today is a lot like yesterday and tomorrow will be a lot like today. And we all know the old saying that the more things change, the more things stay the same, which was of course Schopenhauer's point, which you pointed out earlier. So these things remain very relevant to our lives, very relevant to our ancestors and our descendants, and will remain so for quite some time. My point is that it simply has to be put in a larger context, and within the smaller context we can talk about all of these things that philosophers have traditionally talked about, but we can also expand our perspective and talk about things that haven't always been at the center of philosophy of history. But like I said earlier, this is one of the reasons I find Augustine so interesting, because he operates at these very big scales of talking about the beginning and the end of time.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was watching your episode on Boethius, and you were sort of making a point about how certain texts became lost or just weren't as widely accessible, or they didn't have as big of a reach. So, for example, Duns Scotus versus Boethius. It made me think of for example, the decades leading up to the fall of Constantinople, where all of these texts are coming in from ancient Greece to Italy. Probably one of the driving factors of the Renaissance is this rediscovery of old knowledge that reframes it. I was just thinking of this when you were talking about sort of the blind spots of our familiar historical lens or what have you,
Mhm.
of all that's left out. In a very strange way, the future is constantly changing the meaning of the past as we acquire more insight into those blind spots, and then it completely reframes or provokes a complete reinterpretation of what we thought we knew about the past.
I agree. And this has become what I was talking about in that episode on Boethius and the historiography of philosophy has become really important to me, because I hadn't realized how relatively recent a lot of our tradition is. Now, one of the examples I used is how Anglo-American philosophy at the present time, the most influential philosophy is Hume. And we all know that Hume wasn't successful as a philosopher in his lifetime, but as a
A
historian.
historian, yeah, that's interesting.
Then I started digging into it, and there wasn't a vernacular language version of Plato's Republic until an English language translation in the 18th century that was published in Glasgow. So that before that, as you said, that with the books and the scholars flowing out of Byzantium as the city fell to the Turks, then many of them went to Italy and they brought their Greek editions of Plato with them, and then people like Marsilius Ficino learned Greek specifically to be able to translate the whole of Plato and Plotinus into Latin. So we had Latin in Western Europe. We had Latin editions of Plato and Plotinus and a number of other figures who we hadn't had all throughout the Middle Ages. The entirety of the Middle Ages, say 500 to 1500 AD, the whole period is dominated by Aristotle and the reception of Aristotle, because Boethius translated a few texts, primarily Aristotle, and commented on them in Latin. So in Western Europe, there was just this small smattering of a few books that were the basis of the entire medieval philosophical tradition, whereas in Byzantium, they had all these Greek texts and they spoke Greek, so they knew how to read them, but they sat on them and they did nothing with it. Where in the West, they took these scraps and they built an enormous edifice of philosophy, and they had such an appetite for it, then it drew in the full text of Aristotle, which was then translated in the 13th century. Actually, in the 12th century, a lot of the translations took place. And then, as you pointed out later in the Renaissance, then Plato becomes an increasingly important force, but Plato was an increasingly important force as a Latin text. And people didn't start reading Plato in the vernacular until the 18th century. So, it's hard for me to imagine a philosopher going through their career without knowing the allegory of the cave, which is, I produced an episode on the allegory of the cave. It's kind of a weird one, which I compare it to subsurface ocean worlds. But to me, this is a really important philosophical thought experiment, and also it's about the calling of philosophy to emerge from the cave out into the light, and to see the forms as they truly are, and not through the veil of appearance. But that's something that's only been around, about as long as the United States has been around, which isn't very long when you start looking at historical timescales.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, because there's that famous quote from Whitehead that all philosophies have been a footnote to Plato, and yet
Yeah.
that would leave out 1,000 years or so where
There were no footnotes to Plato. Yeah, there were no
right,
footnotes to Plato in the Middle Ages.
right, which is it's really fascinating. It's funny to go back to the Renaissance for a moment. you remarked, how people are always saying that things are always changing today, or like we just have this sort of ready-made language of speaking about the modern era, modernity. And recently it became of interest to me, partially because I've been thinking a lot about postmodernism. And, I kind of had a realization that I didn't really know. Okay, when was the first time we started to talk about modernity and the modern age? And that led me, of course, to the Renaissance humanist writers. And the funny thing about it is that there's all these ideas about, or not ideas, there's a series of events that are associated with the beginning of the modern age, right? The printing press, fall of Constantinople, Columbus, the Reformation. But then I was looking into the usage of the term modern, and of course I find, Petrarch talking about Antiqua and Nova. It's this really specifically Italian way of looking at the world at the time, right? Because as you mentioned with Augustine, it's history is sort of this progression to the end of the world that's not cyclical. But this is where we get the idea of the Dark Ages, because of course it's the darkness between the last time. I mean, Petrarch's using it to refer to a lack of texts, right? But there was a value judgment there that essentially things were good for us the last time there was an Italian, that Italy was the center of the Roman Empire. It wasn't this Germanic Holy Roman Empire, right? And there's a lot of patriotism in these histories of Florence that they're writing, where we get the first kind of stirrings of a notion of like we're in a modern age now, and we had something in the middle between these Middle Ages between us and the dark times that were started when Rome fell, right? And maybe there was some kind of sort of identification they were making as well between the form of government, their form of life, right, with these Italian communes that rise up to the Greek city-states and the Roman Republic. And there's all sorts of various different opinions. Obviously, Machiavelli sees it very differently. He wants to see a new Italian empire rise up.
He also wants to push the French out of Italy.
Right. He's tired
barbarians.
of getting shoved around every time there's a geopolitical struggle. The observation that I made was that, for one, it's very striking that we're coming up with this idea of modern times really as a recapturing of the ancient, right? In that context, in the Italian Renaissance, it's a new era because we're sort of like rediscovering the ancient, which is very differently from how people use that term now. But it also just struck me that, what would you make of the claim that most of our periodizations of history and our ways of doing historiography seem to reflect some need in the present moment?
I completely agree. There's a sense in which all history is a mapping of the present onto the past, and people are writing about the past because they want to illuminate or inspire or inform the present for their own, how we got where we're at and where we're going, which is, the eternal questions, as in the Gauguin painting. One of the themes that I've been talking about recently is how one of the persistent features of Western civilization has been its recurrence to the model of classical antiquity, but it always takes place under different circumstances and at later times in history. So the most famous example of this, of course, is the Italian Renaissance, which is a primarily literary uncovering of the texts of people like Cicero and Seneca and Roman moralists, and the idea of the Roman Republic and the nobility of all that. But of course, the Middle Ages were also recurring to that model of classical antiquity, but they did it in a different way. So just when the Holy Roman Empire was refounded, when not Constantine, Charlemagne was crowned in Rome on Christmas Day in AD 800, recreating supposedly the Roman Empire, and they used some of the symbols too. They dug around and they found, you can find a lot of medieval art that repurposes ancient art. So like a cameo of Octavian or Augustus will be inserted in the front of a medieval crown, and that's both an assertion of, I'm the next Caesar, and I have this continuous relationship to the past. And then if you look at the great Romanesque architecture, particularly in France, you've got, these beautiful churches with perfectly classical pilasters. But it's so they're taking ancient elements, but they're completely repurposing them. And often, we look at it and we say, well, they're really missing the point. They had nothing to do with Roman civilization, but they made their own use of it, just like we make our own use of the past, and we recur to it. And for example, the emphasis in scholarship for the past couple of hundred years of getting the most pristine text you can in the past, and making a critical edition and comparing all of the surviving texts and getting the true work out there, which is not the work that influenced the bulk of our history, because that wasn't known. It's only in the past few decades that we have these really great critical editions of classic works. So we are recurring to antiquity also in our own way and drawing our own lessons from it, as indeed every generation rewrites history for itself, for its own purposes, because we need to be able to, once again, address those timeless questions of who am I, where did I come from, where am I going, what does it all mean?
I think my favorite period in which there was a return to antiquity, or a reimagining, like returning to the Hellenic world again and reimagining it, is probably the German Romantics and the era of like Goethe and Schelling and Hölderlin. I think, and in England too, the Shelleys and Lord Byron, and I don't know. I wonder how much of our perception of the Greek world is actually just mediated through that period too. In a way, like the Fantasia view of ancient Greece, we might call it. I think
there's nothing more modern, though, than a reaction. So we get the initial reaction of modernity against the Dark Ages, and then we get the reaction against the reaction, and then we get the reaction of the Reformation, and then the reaction against that is the Enlightenment, and the reaction against that is the Romantic period, which, as you say, was primarily dominated by German scholarship. So there's always going to be another reaction, and the attempt to christen a postmodern period is the most modern thing ever, because it's just saying we're reacting against modernity itself.
True, yeah, and now we're coming up with all sorts of labels, like meta modern is the new one.
Yes,
I think most people don't even know what they're saying when they use most of these words, but. Yeah, because, of course, what are the defining features of postmodernism? If you listen to like a popular intellectual, they'll list things like they think that all truth is relative, or that they're skeptical of even the most basic truth claims. And I'm like, well, you can find those in the pre-modern world. You can go read Pyrrho or, the Sophists. You want to talk about like relativity of views, and so, it's just funny to me that, again, as you said, in referencing Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun.
And that's one of the fundamental positions of the way people view history, is that there's nothing really new is happening. We're just going along with the flow. It was the same for people in the past. It'll be the same for people in the future. And then, of course, that attitude is compared to the idea of, we've got the latest and greatest that's ever happened, and it's going to be even greater tomorrow. So
it's funny too, going to the quarrel between the ancients and moderns in France, and what they mean by modern at that time as the most enlightened civilization ever would be considered totally like retrogressive today. They're talking about Catholic piety and a newfound sense of like the power of the throne. And yes, a scientific enlightenment and erudition and all these things, but it's associated with a whole suite of ideas that no one would recognize as modern now. But it's just funny that, even there, this is the greatest time that's ever to be alive,
There's a passage from Boswell. I can't remember if it's from the Life of Johnson or from his journal of when he went on a tour of the Hebrides with Johnson. But they talk about the convenience of their carriage and all the wonderful things that civilization is, and talking about how crazy Rousseau is for rejecting civilization. And it's the same thing. We're so advanced now. Look at us. We've got it really comfortable, and most people would view an 18th century carriage ride across the Hebrides as something pretty roughing it, as it were.
Yeah, of course. Well, this brings us, what comes to mind at this point for me is Nietzsche, because of course he had the essay on the use and abuse of history for life. And I know you've talked about that in the past. I think it's been a while since I've listened to what you had to say about it. So maybe we could talk about some of those ideas a little bit, or just the general idea, I guess, to start off with here. Because we've kind of been talking about with this idea of history being interpreted through the needs of the present moment, that implicit within that is that history is always used for something. Of course, Nietzsche in that essay has, this notion that there are these kind of three uses for history that he gives of monumental, antiquarian, and critical. What kind of uses do you see being most prevalent today for history? Do they fit into Nietzsche's schema, or do you see indeed abuses for history going on today that fall under that kind of schema that he has there?
I see both, and I think if most prevalent here means what's getting the most clicks on social media, it's definitely political, and it's usually critical, not always. So we've got one way to shore up your credentials is to criticize everything that came before you and say how horrible the world was, and even in the recent past, and we've at least now glimpsed the promised land. If we could just push it a little
Right.
more, then
Really quickly, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, where the last man says, "Formerly all the world was mad."
yeah. But you still see all of these three tendencies that Nietzsche wrote about: the monumental, the antiquarian, and the critical. They're all players, you could say, at the moment. With maybe the antiquarian is not very. I guess the antiquarian has been transformed into scholarship. So we've got a whole industry of people who spend their entire careers being antiquaries. They wouldn't be the antiquaries that like Nietzsche paints them in the use and abuse of history, but essentially that's what they're doing. And the critical historians are the people who are condemned to everything that came before the present moment, and the monumental historians are the ones looking to the great deeds of past men to give themselves the courage they need to do the things that they want to do. It reminds me of I was watching a video about Machiavelli's house, and they talked to a curator who works there, and she talked about all of the politicians like Tony Blair who had come there to visit, essentially paying their respects to the man who created modern political thought as
Right.
an
Politics as a
exercise.
science.
Yeah, politics as a science, but also politics as an assertion of virtue. So,
Yeah, true.
and the possibility of transforming society through measures that you don't disclose to the ordinary people because you have to appear pious and just and like you're keeping your promises to most people, but behind the scenes you're ruthless and, to put a word on it, Machiavellian, and in order to get things done, because sometimes you have to break eggs to make omelets, as they say. So we can find this tradition still there of people paying their respects. And here Machiavelli then becomes one of the great figures that people refer to gird their loins, as it were, for their next enterprise. And Nietzsche is very much the same thing, because Nietzsche has never been, despite the fact that Nietzsche has been overwhelmingly influential in academic philosophy over the past 100 years, and especially over the past, say, 50 years, he's never fully been domesticated. And all kinds of people read Nietzsche and find in it all kinds of different things, and a lot of radical things. Just like a lot of people are radicalized by reading Marx, a lot of people are radicalized by reading Nietzsche, and they feel that the scales have fallen from their eyes and they finally see the world as it is for the first time. And Machiavelli has that influence on people too. So these are the figures now who are our monumental figures that people are reaching back to, Machiavelli and Nietzsche, because they show us that we can put aside, and this is, I'm interrupting myself, but you can see that this is a classic metaphysical distinction between appearance and reality. We're pushing aside the mere appearance of society that we maintain for purposes of politesse and just trying to appear as though we're going about and being a respectable member of society. But we're throwing all that aside for the real way that things get done. So we're in this way that that Nietzsche and Machiavelli become our metaphysical tutors to help us see the world as it really is, just like the story of the allegory of the cave is to ascend from the cave and to see the world as it really is. Now, what Plato saw when he came out of the cave was very different from what Nietzsche saw when he came out of the cave, but they're engaged in the same project.
Yeah, I think Nietzsche would have said the same, that Plato was a legislator of values, and
Yeah.
with values that, in his views, through Christianity, Platonism for the people, influences, thousands of years of civilization. Even though, Nietzsche would make a very funny argument, given some of the things we talked about, that even in absentia of Plato's actual texts, the otherworldism of Plato survives in Christianity in some form. But the point being, in this context, that for all the jabs he throws at Plato, you can tell that he respects the power of what he was able to do, of affecting a revaluation of values in the form of the way he presents Socrates. And I think Nietzsche wants to do something similar. Yeah.
I completely agree. And not only did he do something similar, he also adopted, like Plato, a literary style for the exposition of his ideas. So Plato wrote dialogues, and Nietzsche wrote semi-popular works like Thus Spake Zarathustra. So they're communicating their philosophical truth to a wide audience in a way that is, they're not writing technical treatises like Aristotle.
Right. It sort of bypasses I think that I love the way you put that Nietzsche hasn't been domesticated, because his work can sort of bypass a lot of the sort of need for erudition or a theoretical approach to philosophy, and sort of speak to people's sentiments or their intuitions. I think that's why people have that idea. It's so funny, the idea of like someone saying the scales fell from my eyes when I read Nietzsche or Machiavelli, because that's, kind of religious language. And
yes,
it is interesting the way you put that they are our monumental thinkers. I would kind of agree. But what does that say when, I remember the line from, I think, Shakespeare, that a damned Machiavellian holds candle to the devil for a while. And of course, all the things that have been said about Nietzsche. I mean, what does it say about our age if those are our monumental thinkers that are sort of affecting that revaluation of values for people? I mean, that, Augustine would say, evil men are now our monumental figures. Surely we're in the end times.
Surely we are. Yeah, so that's a very good point. What does it say about us that Nietzsche and Machiavelli are our monumental figures? And I don't have an immediate answer for that, but it's certainly well worth thinking about. And Nietzsche had such a feeling for unexpected interpretations. One of the things that I really liked is when he's dissing Luther and saying, how Luther didn't get the fact that the church had become a power in the world, and it had installed itself as this great institution that controlled lives and controlled the whole course of history. Luther wanted to tear all that down, and Nietzsche's saying, "Can't you see this was the will to power that has been achieved through the church?" And people don't want to see that. But that's why it's so valuable to read Nietzsche, is when you see that, you say, yeah, that was the expression of the will to power. And you see the same thing in medieval knighthood. You have Bernard, I think it was Bernard of Clairvaux, who wrote a tract about, the ideal knight and his devotion and his piety and all of these things. But as a class, these people were trained for war and very often violent, and they expressed the will to power, and their form of recreation was play fighting, like jousts. And that then, even in the midst of a Christian civilization that had banned chariot racing and gladiatorial combats just made a return in the form of jousting. So, and this is one of the senses in which the more things change, the more things remain the same, in which Schopenhauer is vindicated, because, so the ancient world had gladiatorial combats, but then they got banned. And then the medieval world eventually developed their own gladiatorial combats in the form of jousts. And then people no longer did jousts, but then gentlemen started dueling, and then dueling was made illegal. So now we have, things like internet blood sports and MMA and, melee kind of fighting where it's just anything goes. So
Yeah,
these are the perennial social institutions that are going to come up, whatever kind of society you have,
right.
both because people want to do them and that's an alternative way to assert your own personal will to power, but it's also incredibly popular for the people love watching this stuff.
What do you think in light of that? Because yeah, Nietzsche says some very interesting things about the Renaissance and Reformation. In the Antichrist, he dreams about what if Cesare Borgia had become Pope? That could have saved European civilization. But yeah, it's like he says. I believe the way he puts it in one passage is that essentially the spirit of paganism sat on the throne of the church.
Yeah.
And then Luther and his monks, who were not, he said they were by no means tired of medieval ways of life, ruined the whole harvest of the Renaissance. And that in a way, there's a sort of narrative in Nietzsche that this Protestant way of looking at things is in a way of maybe a recapitulation to the Socratic is a way of looking at it. This obsession with logical coherence of doctrine, right? Like we can't have these contradictions. We can't have the church being the moral authority while they're also, occasionally the popes are raising armies and sacking cities and fathering illegitimate children and selling indulgences. Like we can't tolerate this contradiction. I guess I would ask, sort of the way we've been talking about this, do you think that Nietzsche's view of things actually holds? Or was there just as much of a will to power within Lutheranism? Because I could kind of see both arguments. Like I see what Nietzsche's saying, but I tend to think that a lot of the time there's sort of a moral gloss that we put on things that isn't necessarily, it's just like a way of reinterpreting what we were going to do anyway. I don't know what.
Yeah, rationalization in the classic Freudian sense.
Yeah.
We're going to do what we're going to do, and then later we produce the rationalization that says why it's all justified. But the Reformation was a will to power on the part of the German nobility who were sick and tired of being under the yoke of the church. And that took an alternate form next door in France. We were talking earlier about how Machiavelli wanted to throw the French out of Italy. But in that late medieval, early modern period, France had become the 800-pound gorilla of Europe. It had the biggest standing army. It had the most people. So even though they weren't considered, the equals in culture of the Italians, they had the military power to just basically march across Italy and no one could stand against them. So the French got back at the Italian-based church that way. The Germans cut the cord, as it were. And the early Reformation scholars focused on the conversion of the nobility, and we call this the magisterial Reformation. And they ruthlessly put down, initially, when they still could, they put down movements like the Anabaptists, who were not the elites of society, who wanted to separate themselves off and create a kind of ideal communism in Munster.
Right.
But clearly these societies of the north of the Alps that had become the Holy Roman Empire of the German peoples, they didn't want to be subservient to Italy any more than the French did. And the French had their own monarch of a unified country, so they could do their own thing. And the Germans did their own thing by separating off. And then the settlement of the whole Reformation with the end of the 30 Years' War is the Treaty of Westphalia, which enshrines in it the, ius regio, quies religio. I think that's how it goes. I'm not sure. I'm sure I'm butchering the Latin. Sorry for that. But whose country it is, his religion is going to hold in that country. So you get national churches all throughout northern Europe.
And kind of like the beginning of the idea of national sovereignty in a way.
Yeah. My next thing was going to say is the national churches are then followed by nationalism itself as an ideology, and then out of that, then you get a kind of feedback where this idea of nationalism then moves down into Italy, and you get the Italian, Risorgimento and the unification of the Italian state in the 19th century, just like Germany unified as a nation state in the 19th century.
Yeah, the way Nietzsche would sort of see it is that the effects of the Protestant Reformation are maybe more on the level of values. It's making us more into these sort of he would say dogmatic. That's our mode of thought now.
You compared them Protestants earlier to Socrates. Nietzsche was purposefully insulting towards Socrates, where the hypertrophy of the dialectic or something like that is what he attributes to. And yeah, you see that in the Protestant reformers too. And as Kenneth Clark said in his Civilization series, these men of the North believed that there was such a thing as truth, and they wanted to get at it. And it's the same Socratic impulse. So sorry for
Yeah.
interrupting.
Oh no, that's fine. Well, because I wanted to comment on what you said, that it indirectly leads to the birth of nationalism in a way, which it's so funny because it's Nietzsche is so often a critic. It may be even a contradiction in his work, possibly, that he's so often a critic of really the power of the dialectic or of the idea, right? All of these interpretations are sort of a conscious gloss on reality; they're post hoc. But it would seem to then be odd to kind of go after the Protestants with the tack that he takes, when really it's sort of the maybe the more interesting thing about the Protestant Reformation, or indeed most historical flashpoints, are the ways in which they insensibly change the world, the ways in which they have consequences that aren't even perceptible until hundreds of years later. And I think it's an apocryphal quote, but it's so good that it doesn't matter that it's fake. That when Mao was asked about whether the French Revolution was a good thing or not, the story goes that he said it's too soon to say.
I
And
haven't heard that, but that's great.
right, I think the reason why it's apocryphal is because it was actually like some other Chinese official, not Mao, and he might have been referring to some more recent event. But I think it's true, regardless of whether it's apocryphal. That in a way, it's always too soon to say, because the French Revolution. I mean, my God, the ripple effects of how that has profoundly changed the world. You can't say was that a good development or not until we know what all of those effects will be, and they never end. They're constantly
Well,
spilling into one another.
we have a paradigm for that from ancient thought, which is the idea that Solon, when he visits Croesus in the first few pages of the histories of Herodotus, he says, "Count no man happy until he's dead." Because Croesus is
Yeah,
this richest king ever, and he's saying, "Well, look at all these great things I got. Who's the greatest? Who's the greatest, happiest man?" And Solon says, "Tell us of Athens," and this isn't what Croesus wants to hear. And then after going through these stories, he makes the point explicit: count no man happy until he's dead, because and this is what Hegel is saying when he says the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the setting of the
yeah,
sun. You can only have that kind of understanding. You can only gather the sheaves together after it's all been harvested, and that's the end of the season. So the end of the season for a civilization is the end of that civilization. As long as that civilization is ongoing, it's going to have new development. Well, there are exceptions. If a civilization enters into a prolonged period of stagnation and experiences no development, maybe then you could say, okay, this is a spent tradition. We can say something about it. But as long as it's still developing, as our contemporary world is very much in the grip of the forces released by the French Revolution, yeah, it's too early to say. And also, you could say that this a quote attributed to Mao, like I said, I hadn't heard that before, but it's a great quote, plays into the trope that Foucault discusses in, I think it's the beginning of The Order of Things, where he talks about the Chinese civilization being the most deaf to temporal events. So,
oh,
you would expect someone from a 3,000-year-old civilization to say, "Oh yeah, this happened 250 years ago." Well, it's who knows. We'll wait and see how that goes.
right, right. Yeah, it's like the newest thing that just happened, basically. Yeah, that the quote from Hegel, the owl of Minerva unfolds its wings at dusk. That sort of it's always in retrospect that we are able to achieve an understanding. I guess in light of that, what do you think of attempts to use history to predict the future? So I'm a big fan of Peter Turchin's work. I'd be interested in your thoughts on him. There are others as well, though, who try to sort of construe broad patterns. I mean, the interesting thing is that Turchin actually says this is no longer history once I'm doing this. He came up with a new term, the
Cliodynamics.
Cliodynamics. Right, right. Because it's I'm trying to take this and turn it into like a mathematized science. So obviously it's not history at that point. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's possible to have some sort of useful framework, predictive framework distilled out of history?
I clearly think that there are patterns there. This is one of the ways in which philosophy of history has either been failed by its practitioners, or philosophy of history as a discipline has failed the intellectual obligation it has, because so much of this conversation takes place on such a superficial level.
Mm,
Like, if you take the Hegelian schema of, what's happened, since the ancient world up through the French Revolution, and the ancient world knew that that none are free, and that the next knew that some are free, and the Germans know that all are free. Uh,
hmm. And that's the
and
end. That's the end of
and
history.
and and, and that's the end of history. Yeah. But people take these extremely simplistic ideas as though you have a choice between history developed into three parts, or history doesn't develop at all. And that's just ludicrous. And because there's so many different ways in which things uh, develop, and there's so many, even if we say that, some people regard it as a horrible, unconscionable claim to talk about, cultural evolutionism, and that
Mhm.
history passes through stages. Now, the classic example of this is not only Hegel, but it's also Marx. So you have the slave mode of production, and then whatever comes next, and then the industrial mode of production, and then that gives way to, when the expropriators are expropriated, then you get the communist utopia, and then there's things are different. So, but you've got this series of stages based on technology and an economic paradigm of how you're going to produce the goods for your society. And I've actually read, I can't cite the source, but I've actually read people saying that things like, if the series of steps or stages that happen aren't deterministic, then it doesn't make any sense at all, or it's not even worth saying. But you can have a society pass through a revolution, and pass through a republican stage, and then have a dictatorship, and then have another revolution, and then go back to something else. There's so many different ways that you can move the counters around on the board, but people get stuck on these very simplistic ideas, like you have in Hegel and a few other famous philosophers of history. And I'd really like to get beyond that, to get to the point where we can talk about maybe a taxonomy of patterns, or a taxonomy of kinds of events, or a taxonomy of actions that people can take. And then we can start talking about the combinations that these can take, and how that they can, if they become sufficiently complex, that they can pass over thresholds, and then you get new qualitatively different properties hold in a society. So, for example, we've had inquiry into the nature of the world since the ancient world. And then with the scientific revolution, then that ramps up with the scientific method, and you get all this scientific knowledge and the technology that follows from this. And it's reached a point where it changes our relation to the planet, it changes our relation to the past and the future, and something new has appeared in history. That doesn't mean that everything before is false and everything in the future is going to be great and wonderful. It just means that there's been a change because some threshold is met that hasn't been met before. Just like when civilization itself got started, you had a transition that went on literally for thousands of years, where there were hunter-gatherer tribes in one region, one geographical region, and people were settling down and creating agriculture and creating villages, and then eventually villages would cluster together and you'd get cities. And then that fundamentally changed our way, the human way of life, and changed the direction of history. If you hold that history is an account of what happens to civilizations, then history begins with civilizations, and it's the same thing. So I think that we need to get beyond these overly simplistic ideas of both of cultural relativism and cultural evolutionism,
Mm.
and start seeing things in a more pluralistic way, to see the different combinations that we haven't yet visited. Now, just like we were saying a little bit ago about the French Revolution and not having played out yet. And it hasn't yet, because there's all kinds of, you can go back and read the detailed histories, there are a great many of them, of the French Revolution, all the things that were going on, all the ideas that were coming out, and they're still being acted upon in different ways today, and they haven't yet been exhausted, even as new things are appearing, like the technological, the increasing technological sophistication of our communications and transportation networks and things like that.
So would you say that somebody like Peter Turchin, would the point be that his attempt at turning history or drawing a predictive science out of history is inevitably going to end up oversimplifying things? Because of course he's just looking at, say, structural demographic trends. Is that going to be too simplistic?
I think it serves a role, and I think it's valuable. I think it's the Cliodynamics in particular, I think is a little weak on its theoretical side, because they're making a real effort to have an empirical science. And I respect that. I respect what they're doing, and I think it's valuable. One of the problems that's engaged in what I earlier called that we need to find a greater degree of pluralism in our theoretical understanding of history is that people don't want to hang around to have these things explained to them. I mean, how can you force how can you force people to sit in their seats to listen to you talk about the 17 different ways the civilization could originate and the 25 different ways that it can fail? And then when you take those together and you multiply them, you get all the different ways in which they can rise and fall. And then you get a typology that literally extends to hundreds of different types. And people stop paying attention at that point. They want a simple, they want a lumper taxonomy, not a splitter taxonomy. And there's a role for this, of course, because there was a scientific paper that came out a few years ago called "Fuck Nuance," because people were getting so into the nuance of things that they were losing the picture of science as trying to frame general laws. So obviously there's a role for science to frame general laws that ignore nuance.
It's like the Reddit stereotype, right? Well, actually, that's a bit of an oversimplification, and yeah, it's like to a certain point, it becomes counterproductive.
Yeah, and I'm guilty of that myself. I confess to it. But
me too.
One of the ideas from philosophy of history that has been influential to me, and something I've talked about in many episodes, is Wilhelm Windelband's distinction between the ideographic and the nomothetic. Now, nomothetic, nomos is the Greek word for law, so the nomothetic is the law-like, and the ideographic is the particularistic. And he made a distinction that was then further elaborated by others like Heinrich Rickert, that history was an ideographic science that aimed at getting things more particularistic and more fine-grained, whereas the natural sciences, like physics, which is the paradigm of natural science, was about getting at the law-like things that could be enunciated in mathematical terms, like force times acceleration, force times what is it? The FMA, force times acceleration equal mass, whatever it is. I know I'm screwing that up.
Yeah, it's fine.
You can see we're not physicists.
Force equals mass times acceleration. I think that's what it is. Yeah.
Sorry for mangling that.
May the force be equal to mass times acceleration.
Very good. But he also wrote in another text how science is like a pendulum that swings between a nomothetic pole and an ideographic pole. And I think we see this very clearly in our times. Anthropologists in particular, they play this kind of parlor game where somebody will make a generalization about society and say, no, there's a tribe in New Guinea that does this, and therefore your generalization is wrong.
Right.
But those are outliers. But as society itself undergoes certain changes and favors, whether they want to see things simply in terms of a few laws or see things in their particularity in terms of the diversity of various instantiations of a law, you get a change in science. So Enlightenment science was very reductionistic. Enlightenment, like the law of motion we were just talking about, or Newton's theory of gravitation, and all these things. They're gleefully reductionist in throwing away everything but what can be covered by the law. And then, several hundred years later, we moved on to a point where there's a much greater interest in even making the hard sciences, so-called, into ideographic sciences, where we note all the little exceptions, and we've got this massive particle zoo and all these kind of things going on. And the next swing of the pendulum, if we last, is that we come back around to a more nomothetic and less ideographic formulation of our understanding of the world.
What do you think drives that? Is it a cultural is it, to be Hegelian again, is it a zeitgeist thing? Because that would be kind of interesting, right? If cultural trends might affect the way that we do science, and thus what our assessment of the objective reality is.
No, I don't think there's any question that cultural trends affect the way we do science. And one of the things I've written about, but not recently, is how in the early stages of the Enlightenment bound itself very closely to science, and it was all about science. But as the centuries have elapsed since the High Enlightenment, there's a lot of scientific findings that don't really go along really well with Enlightenment ideology. But we still have very much an Enlightenment ideology controlling how scientific budgets are parceled out. This controls everything in our world now, unfortunately, who gets funded and who doesn't get funded. And then, of course, that translates into people, young people saying, oh, I want to do this. And then their advisor says, well, yeah, that's a wonderful thing, but you won't make any money. If you want to make any money, you have to get into this. This is one of the things that Sabine Hossenfelder talks about constantly in science, where all the money was going into string theory. And she thinks it's effectively a barren branch of physics. It's not going to pan out with anything much. I don't have the expertise to judge what the future of that's going to be, or whether it has gone, whether string theory has gone overboard and been overfunded. But I was certainly
the general public doesn't know anything about physics either. So it is interesting that's kind of what I'm puzzling over, is like, why does string theory suddenly become? Because I remember that moment, right, where maybe about, maybe 15 years ago or so at this point, where all of a sudden string theory was everywhere. That affects the funding of science and like the direction of our search for knowledge. But I'm not expecting you to have an answer, but it's just one of those puzzles. Like, okay, why is string theory, why does that touch the cultural nerve, or not the nerve, but you know what I mean?
But like you said, since the public doesn't know much about this sort of thing, it's just a certain percentage of their paycheck is taken for taxes, and then this is given to the government, and then the government parcels it back out against the institutions, and the institutions parcel it back out again to scientists. But even though scientists represent a tiny fraction of the total population, there's more scientists in the world today than there was ever in the past. There are literally tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of scientists working at the present time. A lot of them are getting money from institutions because it's a career choice, and they follow trends. I mean, they can't help it. I'm not insulting them. I'm not saying, I'm not expecting people to be, it would be inhuman to think that people would not follow trends. And string theory has been a trend. That doesn't mean it's wrong. Some trends are, there's nothing right or wrong about high hemlines or low hemlines. It's just, it's a trend. And the same thing in physics. Now, I think there are cases in philosophy, in physics, in sociology, in anthropology, in all of these academic disciplines, there's ideas that get traction that, basically are barren, and we would do better to forget about them. And I think one way to address that would be 10% of all, government grants going to opposition research. So when somebody gets a huge, $10 million to study something, they have to give $1 million to the person who hates them, who's going to set up a research program that's going to show that everything they're doing is bullshit. I think that would be really valuable.
No, that sounds great. That's a great idea.
How that would apply to philosophy, I'm not sure. I mean, you could, but philosophers don't get many grants, just like mathematicians don't get many grants. They get their careers and they get their paychecks from their institutions, but they don't get the huge instruments built for them like astronomers and physicists, or even the labs that biologists and people doing that kind of thing get.
Yeah, personally, I think the solution is to take some of our tax money and establish Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, where the scientists can be totally liberated from public opinion and wow us with miraculous new technologies. Kind of joking, but maybe this is one of those simplistic single factor analyses again. But Heidegger said that technology was sort of like, what do you call it, like the steering rudder of all historical and social change. And it seems to me that that's part of the reason why it's probably the main thing that, for example, Turchin's Cliodynamics totally ignores because it can't take account of it, right? Is the changes in technology are impossible to predict. It's so obvious. It's so like almost facile to say that, but it's just, I often tell people to imagine themselves from the perspective of someone, say, in the 1500s, or like asking someone from that era to predict the problems and challenges we would face as a result of our technology today, and maybe troubleshoot solutions with that person, right? They would just have no frame of reference at all. If we then pitch ourselves out 500 years into the future, we would realize that we're similarly incredibly ignorant. That is that one of the main reasons then why predictive history is always thwarted. On the other hand, I have noticed that just on a sort of intuitive level, it seems like many of the artists end up having this kind of prescience about the course of technology. Not in a specific irrational argument, right? But I recently saw a clip of David Bowie where he was saying that the internet would completely change the entire structure of society. And the interviewer says, well, it's just a tool, isn't it? And Bowie says, no, it's an alien life form. And that's like an image, right, that he's giving. It's not like a dissertation, it's sort of an artistic, a spontaneous utterance, right? But in a way it's true, because now that they're training these AI models, we found that what they need is data, and the internet facilitated that. And now, at the time when the internet's first coming into being, it would be really hard to discern that, oh, this is going to be a huge tool for training language learning models because of all the data they can gather. They wouldn't have even conceived of that yet. And yet you have David Bowie saying, like, with this kind of artistic intuition, no, that's an alien life form. The other interesting thing he said was that with because the interviewer says, well, they made big predictions about the telephone too. And David Bowie says, yeah, the president said that one day there would be a telephone in every town in America. You realize the absurdity is that it's such an understatement, right? It's like they couldn't even grasp the scope of where technology was headed.
Explicit prediction usually is pretty cringe, but as you say, right, the artistic vision of what's possible sometimes does okay. And we were talking earlier about the tradition and how it gets filtered through what happens after it, and what we end up with is tradition. A lot of the stuff that seems cringe gets set aside. And then sometimes we rediscover something that's been set aside. Maybe it was cringe to the previous age, but now it speaks to us again now in a new way, and it's time to bring it back again. But some things last, and some things don't, and some things have their hour, and some things their hour has not yet come.
Well said. Could you maybe give the audience, if you're willing to, let everyone know what you're working on now, maybe what's coming up on your show, and anything that you want to shout out, anything that you want to draw attention to that you've got going on in the future?
Since I've been recording Today in Philosophy and History episodes for 2 years now, I've covered a lot of the figures I wanted to cover, but I still haven't said everything there I have to say. So I have a list of names. Some people I'm going to return to, some people I haven't talked about yet. Some people I just passed over because I wasn't ready. It was just the birthday of Eugene Minkowski, who wrote a book about time. I was going to do an episode about that last week, but I didn't have the time to read enough of it to produce a coherent episode about it. So there's still figures that I will return to. But what I hope to do is more schematic content, by which I mean building up my own views and giving an exposition of them in a series of talks on various points. So I've become very interested in the idea of deep time. So I'm planning a series of episodes on deep time, which I've already hinted at in my recent episode on what I titled The Beginning and the End of History, and several other related projects. But I want to write more and talk more about the philosophy of deep time and its relation to philosophy of history. I have a lot of projects, but I don't know what I'm going to end up spending time on, because I focus on exclusively what interests me. And since that shifts around, then I end up changing. So one of the series I've been thinking about for quite some time has the working title, The Good Life in Historical Perspective. So this is on the intersection of ethics and history. So I want to examine how people have conceived the good life in different societies and different periods of history, and review, this ancient conception of what the good life is and how it gets reinterpreted as things change. So that's one of those Schopenhauerian points, which doesn't really change, that everybody wants to live the good life, but what it means to live the good life is very different in different eras, and I'd like to talk about that. So I have an outline for that I've been working on for some time. It's not really close to being finished, but something that's always in the back of my head, and the work on deep time and many other projects. So I intend to continue to producing single one-off episodes about particular thinkers and their ideas, and hopefully also transition to more series of talks that can get more into the details of particular doctrines.
Wonderful. Yeah, I know exactly what you mean, by the way, about being guided by interest. And I also have many, many projects that I'm working on simultaneously, which is almost a must for me, because I need to have multiple irons in the fire. So, well, Nick,
variety is the spice of life.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Nick, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for joining me.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I really enjoyed this conversation.
Signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.